Sharan Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC. This Congress, the 6th International Congress of the Education International, comes at a critical time. The world is a very bleak place for workers, for their families, and indeed as the old economic orthodoxy reasserts itself and now is driving an austerity program. It's not just the very jobs of teachers that are at risk, but their rights and indeed the benefits that they've bargained for, fought for now for decades. It's not limited either to teachers or indeed to other public sector workers, but it is now a battle for labour rights, for fundamental protections, for employment for all of the world's people right across the globe. We are in a crisis that is now a bitter crisis of unemployment and inequity, and only the union movement can build the organising strength to take this on industrially and indeed politically as we seek to hold the governments of the world to account or indeed to see them off the political stage.
You talk about 3 key points for workers nowadays in terms of social protection, the financial transaction tax, and the investment in green jobs. Can you maybe be more specific in regard with what it represents for teachers especially?
When you look at the international governance structures, you have the G20 meeting coming up, you have the UN spring meetings, the meetings of the IMF in the same period, and indeed you have the climate conference, COP17 in Durban in December, followed by the Rio +20 conference in Brazil. We have a single set of ambitions. We want to see jobs, jobs and jobs, quality jobs, jobs for our young people, jobs for those who've desperately been forced into poverty through unemployment as the first priority. We want to see the informal sector cleaned up so that people have decent work. We want to actually see investment in green jobs. The climate change threat brings with us opportunities, and 2% of GDP can drive a lot of jobs, as well as, of course, provide the services of which education around climate change, the vocational education skills for workers to green up their workplaces and their practices. That's at the heart of your concerns as teachers and educators, as well as indeed the broader unions. We must see a financial transactions tax. We must see the greed of the financial sector brought to heel, where they make just a small contribution to jobs, to public services, and indeed to climate financing. And social protection, our flagship campaign. It is not acceptable that 75% of the world's people, including teachers and education workers, in many poorer countries have no social protection. We want to see unemployment benefits, health, education for all, child protection, pensions, much, much more as part and parcel of the floor of social justice that makes for both a socially equitable future but also an economic stability where workers' rights, social protection and indeed the very heart of our future, employment in a greener economy. Those things certainly are our priorities.
You mentioned earlier that actually teachers are at the center of the storm, and that in some ways sometimes media try to have workers fight each other, but also that they are like in the States, there are really strong attacks on the right for workers to collective bargaining, teachers and others. So how do you see the future of workers organizing, and especially teachers and in the education sector?
The drive for austerity, the response by the orthodox economics that says we must in fact cut public services, we must cut public sector jobs, we must cut wages and benefits. This is putting teachers and other public sector workers in the eye of the storm, a fight for jobs, for those benefits we've gained through bargaining, through deferred wages, and indeed for very fundamentals like the right to collective bargaining. Teachers in Wisconsin, teachers in other states in the US know the attack that's actually been waged on their rights, but so too do teachers in the Ukraine, in Portugal, in Greece, in Romania, in many, many other countries, where in fact they are being denied the fundamental rights that they've come to expect. And it's worse than that. The right-wing politicians, the media, they are perpetuating a story, a narrative that pits worker against worker, that tells private sector workers, workers who are unemployed, that it's the gold-plated pensions, the inflated wages of teachers and other public sector workers that's denying them a job. That's nonsense on all fronts. Public sector workers are not, in fact, enjoying some luxurious wage and benefit arrangements. They fight just to earn a decent living on which they can raise their children. And of course, what we need to do is lift all workers to the level of decent work, not drive the right agenda to actually see workers more impoverished so that profits can soar. We know that the gap between the richest 2 billion people on the planet and the poorest 2 billion people is now 60% higher in just 7 years than it was. That's an obscenity we can't allow.
You also say that migrant workers are scapegoats of our economies. EI is now developing also a policy on migrant workers and teachers around the world. What would you recommend? How do you see it, such a policy?
The result of the global financial crisis, that migrant workers, already often denied labour rights, fundamental rights to residency, to security, to fair wages and conditions. Those migrant workers are now often the victims as governments create a xenophobic framework, as they try to convince people that those migrants are taking their jobs. This is in fact a very, very difficult environment for migrant workers. They are our brothers and sisters. They work alongside of us. They pay taxes in all of our nations. They support their families back home and they raise their children along with ours. We must stand up for them, side by side. They are workers, and workers everywhere must have equal treatment, must have labour rights at the heart of the security they should be afforded.
And finally, as a former EI Vice President, would you have a message to the participants to this 6th EI World Congress?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm very proud to have been a teacher, to still be a member of the Australian Education Union, and of course to have been a former Vice President of Education International. This is a very, very strong global movement of teachers and other education workers, and the world needs you. You are often the glue in your communities. You are the force that will raise the issues that prick the consciences of people who would turn against solidarity, who would turn away from those in need. Not just the education you provide our children, indeed our young adults and those through lifelong learning, but in fact the very values you stand for are essential if we're to preserve and improve the social justice ambitions we all stand for, we all fight for, and we know are the basis of a just future.
Thank you very much.